Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I've received emails over the last, 6 months to a year with a similar theme, a similar question. They wanted me to respond on my view of Christianity and evolution. Well, I haven't done it, and I haven't done it for a few reasons. One is because I don't care that much, and I might make you upset, but also because I wanted to get my thoughts together, and my thoughts change a good bit, but I'll just tell you where I'm at, and you can take it for what you want, no big deal, and you can, do what you want to with this podcast. Let me say a few things. First off, I'm not a specialist in evolutionary theory. I'm not, nor do I claim to be. I've never claimed to be, and I don't mean to speak as if I am one. Lord knows that is not my specialty. I've had my biology classes in high school undergraduate degree like most people, and that's fine. I've read from specialists, I've watched YouTube videos and debates and lectures and heard presentations by specialists, but I myself am not a specialist. So what I'll do is talk about what I am more specialized in, which is, I think, how evolutionary theory fits into a Christian worldview. I know a little more about the Bible and Christian theology than I do all those other topics. So let me say a few things at the beginning, like I said. So first, I'm not a specialist. Second thing is, I do know enough from the specialist that the simplistic picture of a family tree starting from a protoplasm kind of stuff and then developing, which is typically called neo-Darwinism, is falling on the wayside. It's coming in hard times as a scientific theory. Well, I'm fine with that. It's a scientific theory. So the typical definition of evolution for a typical specialist, they don't make distinction between a macro and a micro. Microevolution is what happens on a molecular and a small level that we see in laboratories and so forth. And they would deduce from that a macroevolution. That is, this has been going on for millions and millions and millions of years. And when you have this arbitrary natural selection acting on small inherited variations, they allow the individual's organism the ability to survive or reproduce. And that's what creates all the different species. So to go from individual variations to new species, most of the time Christians and others will make a big distinction between the two, and I'm fine with that, but I know that in the field they typically don't, because they'll say one implies the other easily. And this neo-Darwinian approach is falling on hard times. You need to go to a website called thethirdwayofevolution.com. The Third Way, not wave, but way, W-A-Y, thethirdwayofevolution.com. It is a website ran by specialists. It is not a website for intelligent design people. It's not made of creationism. It's not a covert religious operation. This is just from scientists of all kinds of faith traditions, particularly non-faith people, who are making just one of the many websites and books and whatever that are and conferences that are taking place around the world that demonstrate that it's too simple. This neo-Darwinism is not cutting it. In fact, on thethirdwayofevolution.com, it says this right at the beginning. I'll just read it. The vast majority of people believe that there are only two alternative ways to explain the origins of biological diversity. One way is creationism, that depends upon intervention by a divine creator. That is clearly unscientific because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force into the evolutionary process. I'll make one quick comment there. It's always funny to me when non-religious people make claims about religion, and they always use the word, not always, but in my experience, it's almost always, they do use the term very, very often, arbitrary. That is, it's unscientific because it brings an arbitrary supernatural force. Well, that's silly. If I'm a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, there's nothing arbitrary about the Creator doing things inside of creation at all. Arbitrary would be a random, unrelated supernatural force. Well, it's nothing arbitrary at all if it's true that God intervenes in creation. So I don't have any idea why that makes it unscientific. But anyway, the paragraph continues. The commonly accepted alternative is neo-Darwinism, which is clearly naturalistic science, but ignores much contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of hereditary variation. Neo-Darwinism ignores important rapid evolutionary processes such as symbiogenesis, horizontal DNA transfer, action of mobile DNA, and epigenetic modifications. Moreover, some neo-Darwinists have elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems without a real empirical basis. Many scientists today see the need for a deeper and more complete exploration of all aspects of the evolutionary process. And I've heard of Stephen Jay Gould, who died not too long ago. He was very well known in the 70s and 80s. He was a Jew and agnostic, taught at Harvard, is considered one of the leading evolutionary biologists of the century. And he said that neo-Darwinism is dead. That was back in the 80s. So this is not a newfangled idea. It's taking a long time. It will take a long time for the textbooks to really change. It seems to me, based on my observations, that the major distinction that's going on, the major maybe analogy to use of what's going on in the scientific realm is much like putting together the law of relativity with what happens in quantum mechanics. That is, we don't have a good theory that unites the way bodies and motions at large work based on what happens when you're vis-a-vis on the molecular level, on the very, very small, tiny scale. I feel a similar thing about evolution. That is, there are things that make a lot of sense on the macro level, but on the micro level, on a molecular level, things don't fit so nicely into the picture. And so there seems to be a need to create a third way or some other way to explain how this all relates together. And I've heard the specialists in lectures and debates talk about how they'll ask Nobel Prize winning biologists how it works on a molecular level, on a cell level, and they have no response. So I think on a scientific level alone, there are some great difficulties with understanding the typical textbook way to look at how evolutionary works. Well, okay, fine. So just as a scientific model, in a way, that's fine. That's what scientists do. They like to debate, figure out what goes on in the world. And particularly as this quote said, the neo-Darwinism is clearly naturalistic science. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, naturalistic means, of course, that all causes of all effects occur by other effects from other causes. That is, there's an unending chain of quote-unquote naturalistic causes that an event cause an event, all the way back to the very first Big Bang. And the second you assume anything outside of this, what they believe is a closed system, as soon as you suggest anything outside of the system, you're no longer doing science from a naturalistic perspective. Now, they would say you're not even doing science. That is, for most scientists, particularly the ones who are not religious, they would say that to do science, you have to always assume naturalism, that we're in a closed system. It's much like fish talking to each other in a fish bowl. There's nothing outside the bowl. You have to assume that. And that's one reason why it seems to me in my research, the minor it is, they get so frustrated and ticked off because when you start bringing up God or Creator or anything like that, they would say you're screwing up the system. Don't smuggle in someone else who has to dip their hand in the water of the fish bowl. First, let's see if we can figure out just within the system what occurs. Well, that's a philosophical worldview. Science does not lead you to that conclusion. It's a philosophical worldview that may or may not be true. I think it's false, and nevertheless, that's a different podcast, and I've talked about that a lot. Another podcast and in my book that I wrote. So, in general, all I'm saying is, from what I understand from specialists, evolutionary and the neo-Darwinism is falling on hard times, and they'll keep debating that. That's fine. Great. Okay, having said that, I do think some type of evolutionary process has been demonstrated, and there are a couple ways to get at it, and I'm not going to argue for it at all. just for example, because I want to move on to how this relates to the Bible and a Christian worldview as quickly as I can. But there's a YouTube video maybe you might find helpful to you, and the title of it is real simple. It's uploaded by John Walton, who's an Old Testament scholar, and the title is called Dr. So Dr. period Stephen, this with a PH, Stephen Schaffner, Schaffner, Dr. Stephen Schaffner. It's on YouTube, and he gave a quick presentation at a conference at which John Walton and others were a part. And just listen to it for yourself, or watch it for yourself, and see what you think about it. There are videos like that all over that give the reasons why the average scientist thinks evolution to some degree is just as absolute proven fact as that the earth is round and so forth. So there are different videos like that you can watch, figure out, go for it. I think what most Christians have a problem with is whether or not evolutionary, as we understand, fits into a Christian worldview. And that's why I want to spend more time on that. So there are different ways to get at it. You might have heard these terms before. I'm not going to talk much about it at all, but just to bring it up, you might have heard the gap theory. That says that there were a gaps of thousands or millions of years between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, that when it says God created the heavens and the earth, what happens in 1:2, where he starts the small details, there was a long gap. And that's the trying to figure out our scientific explanation that the universe, I'm convinced, is billions of years old, close to 14 billion years old. How do we do that in Genesis? That's the gap theory. The day-age theory is the theory that posits each day mentioned in Genesis was actually a much longer period, thousands or millions of years. So a day doesn't really mean 24-hour period. There are a lot of people will say that's exactly what it is, and that day, yom in Hebrew, can mean literal 24-day. It can also mean a time period. Anyway, you can join the debate all you want there. A third major view is called theistic evolution. Theistic evolution is the theory that posits that God created, basically the basics of what needs to happen, and then he stepped back and let the evolutionary process work on its own. So it's theistic in that he rigs the game, but he lets quote-unquote naturalistic mechanisms to develop as they need to develop. So he designed it, but then he designed it such that it would do its own thing. That means he doesn't intercede. He doesn't jump in there from time to time. Now, a fourth major way is called progressive creation. That said, God does do what he does in theistic evolution, but he does step in at different times to guide the process. So theistic evolution typically posits that God steps back and then lets the clock unwind and see what happens. But this progressive creation is that God does, in fact, do the miraculous. He jumps in from time to time and goes from there. So what most of these theories have in common is the most Christians are trying to grapple with the fact of the Bible talks about God being creator. And of course, you have texts in Genesis 1 and 2, and particularly in the book of Job, there's a whole lot about God being creator and how he created in Job. So the issue is, what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact the Bible has talk about God being creator, but how do we jive that with modern scientific theory? And I very much empathize with you might say, that struggle. But here's the deal. And this is a shame because a lot of people won't listen to the podcast based on my view alone, because this has, for a lot of people, become the litmus test of whether or not you are a Christian. I don't read the Bible that way. I don't read the Bible as a text or full of texts which need to comport to scientific theory, because I do not think the Bible is a science textbook, nor do I think it contains any scientific theories about the way the world works. For example, where in the Bible is there any mention of a mechanism of how organisms develop? A mechanism of how organisms develop. For example, look in Genesis 1:11-12. In Genesis 1:11-12, it says this, in the NET translation. God said, let the land produce vegetation. Let the land produce vegetation. It didn't say he created vegetation. He said, let the land produce it. Plants yielding seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. It was so. Verse 12, the land produced vegetation. Plants yielding seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. God saw that it was good. So we have in Genesis one of a few references where God let the land, so called for the land to do the work. The land to do the work. But it doesn't have a mechanism. It doesn't tell us how that happens, how long. Now, how long does it take for vegetation to grow? So if you think that all the vegetation grew around the planet in one 24-hour period, then you are assuming that. There's nothing in the text to make us think that vegetation grew faster back then as it does now. So how long would it take for all the vegetation around the globe to grow? Or even if you include just the Mesopotamian culture, it would have taken a long time. Trees still take a long time. You plant a tree now and it might be full grown by the time you're a grandparent. I mean, it just takes a long time. So all that to say, there's no mechanism described. Another thing is, most Christians think that God is the direct cause of all events. I hear this all the time. Even amongst scholars sometimes will say ancient people thought God did everything. That's false. The Bible does not demonstrate that God did everything. They do very much believe God is sovereign. Jews and Christians have always suggested that and argued that and assumed it. That's exactly right. That's biblical. But to be sovereign does not mean he is the direct, immediate cause of all things. That the Bible doesn't support that. It means at minimum, nothing that occurs in the universe is beyond his ability to change or correct, except for human free will. He does not make a human's free will not free. But all events that occur are not beyond what he allows to happen, for sure. But let's be biblical again for a second. Look in Mark chapter 4, verse 27. Mark 4:27. And Mark 4:27, we have this, this whole chapter is about Jesus giving parables about seed and soil and so forth. In Mark 4:27 is this parable. We'll start in verse 26. He also said, "The kingdom of God is like someone who spreads seed on the ground. He goes to sleep and gets up night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how." Verse 28, "By itself the soil produces a crop, first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. And when the grain is ripe, he sends out the sickle because the harvest has come." These kind of examples are all through the Gospels. It does not say, then God caused the growth. Then God made a plant grow. He's assuming what any person would have assumed in the ancient world, which is the earth does it somehow. We don't have a mechanism. We don't know how it grows. We're just sure if we give the right soil and we give a lot of water and sun, apparently it grows. It's great. But there's no naturalistic explanation or mechanism explicitly described. But it is assumed that God the Father, or Son or Spirit, are not causing it directly. They didn't believe God caused everything that occurred. So there's just both and approach. Some things we don't know how it happens. But other things we do know how it happens. God inspired certain people. He sends prophets. So forth. But other times it doesn't give any explanation at all. So the Bible doesn't say that. And also, where's this mechanism of how nature develops? In the creeds. At no time in the early church did this ever become a debatable issue. But in most Christian teaching this day, particularly the conservative fundamentalist side, this is absolutely the litmus test of being a Christian, like I've already said. For example, a well-known fundamentalist author, Ken Ham, he writes, quote, "Once you accept evolution and its implications about history, then man becomes free to pick and choose which parts of the Bible he wants to accept." End quote. That's silly. That's silly. What does evolution have anything to do with picking and choosing the parts of the Bible he wants to accept? They're completely unrelated. You can believe there are natural mechanisms at play. You can even believe God designed them. It has nothing to do with picking parts of the Bible you want to accept. I mean, this is nonsense. He goes on to say, as many people do, that there are biblical doctrines dependent on reading Genesis a certain way, particularly Paul's teaching of sin in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15:22, and the doctrine of marriage and future judgment and so forth. Well, there's some truth in that. I want to say just a couple quick thoughts about that, and maybe I'll do another podcast another time. But first of all, the quote-unquote fall isn't in the Old Testament at all. I know in Christian theology we often call it the fall, or in the church called the fall, when Adam and Eve fell and they sinned. That concept is not in the Old Testament. It's never called the fall, and not one person in the entire Old Testament blames Adam for his or her sin. Ever. No one in the Old Testament ever goes back to Adam and Eve and says, "Oh, there's the problem. That's where it all started." The problem is Adam and Eve. It never does that. So if they thought that or believed it, the only reference we have to that at all is that Adam sinned. Adam and Eve sinned. But we have no instance in the Old Testament at all, and I would argue the New Testament as well, I'll go there in a second, where Adam and Eve's sin are blamed for why we have quote-unquote fallen, why the humanity is the way it is. That is, the Old Testament does not explain the quote-unquote fall of Adam and Eve as having a meta impact. that belief comes in Judaism many centuries later, but it's not in the Old Testament. Now, ancient Jews probably would have blamed Adam and Eve for why women have childbirth pains and men have to work as hard as they do in the soil, but not for why they sin. If you go to Romans chapter 5, 12, and 15, and 17, it also does not blame Adam for why I sin. And I hear this all the time by people who cannot tolerate the word evolution inside a Christian worldview. They'll say things like, if Adam didn't fall, then there's no need for salvation. Well, again, I don't find that compelling. The Bible never says that. Look at Romans 5:12. In Romans 5:12, in this section on Romans 5, Paul is talking about, he's just making a great distinction between the difference that Christ makes. He brings life, Adam brought death, but Christ brings life, and so forth. In Romans 5:12, he says this, so then, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and so that's about Adam, all right? Adam sinned. I do believe there is an historical Adam. Adam sinned, and that's how it entered into the world. He's saying what all Jews would believe is that there wasn't sin in the world until Adam did it first. He's the first sinner. Yep. That's what he says in verse 12. Then he says, and so death spread to all people because all sinned. Death spread to all people because all sinned, not because Adam sinned. Death didn't spread to all people because they've inherited Adam's sin. They spread to all people because people keep sinning. People. Look in verse 15. But the gracious gift is not like the transgression. For if the many died through the transgression of the one man, how much more did the grace of God and by the gift of grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, multiply to many? Died through the transgression. They died because it was introduced. They didn't die because he sinned. Now, you can go to verse 12 throughout the history of the church and realize that this all goes back to St. Augustine and how he read the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation, the Vulgate. And he translated the verse in 12, we died because Adam died. And literally in Latin it was said, in whom all have sinned. In whom, ephoi, in whom, from the Greek ephoi. But that's not what it says. It's because all that, or for which, or for that all have sinned. So Augustine and others, but Augustine particularly is the big dog, he argued that in Adam all have sinned. And that's where we get this concept of original sin. That Adam sinned, and because we are genetically related to Adam, when we're born, we are born into the sin of Adam. We have his guilt. We share his guilt because we're born into it. Well, that's not what Paul says in Romans. That's a bad translation. He does not say we've sinned because we were born in Adam. We do not carry on sin genetically. It's not in our DNA. It's not from Adam. So this is that original sin that's still promulgated, particularly by Calvinists, and some Roman Catholics. Of course, the majority of Roman Catholics. But the Orthodox Church does not do that, and a huge portion of Protestants don't believe in original sin. I do believe Adam and Eve sinned. I do believe they introduced, just as Paul said. What Paul actually said was, they introduced sin. They introduced death. Well, then we keep sinning. So the blame is on us. And I remember my dissertation, I did a big chunk of research on the early church fathers, the mothers and fathers of the desert, and there's a lot of literature about those, the monastic order, and there's a lot of talk about Adam, and at no time in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries do they blame Adam for their sin. This development came much later. So the Old Testament authors don't blame Adam for sin, for why they sin, why an individual sins. The New Testament authors don't blame Adam for why an individual sins. It's our responsibility. So I do not, and that's just real briefly, I do not find it compelling when people say, if you don't believe in a particular reading of Genesis, then you don't believe that we need to be saved. That's just silly. People have argued many times and said, and I've seen the books, the articles, the debates, the lectures about if there's no original sin, then Jesus is worthless and they never had to die on the cross. That's just silly. I need Jesus down on the cross because I have sinned. Who gives a rip if Adam sinned? Who gives a rip? I have sinned. I have sinned, and that's why I'm culpable for that. I need Jesus. I need his salvation and his grace, not because of what Adam did, because I have. It's a basic assumption in Judaism and in Christianity for a long, long, long time, and then later on it developed this belief that you got to have a certain understanding of Romans 5 and Genesis and so forth. Anyway, I don't find that compelling. So I don't think these crucial doctrines like sin and death and atonement all depend upon a misreading, I think, of the text. The second thing is, I don't read Genesis out of context. I don't. You might. I don't. I think we read every single text in its literary and historical context as best as we can. I do that because I find the text to be my chief authority for belief and practice. And I do not want to rip it out of context and misunderstand what the original authors, I think, were intending to mean when they wrote it. Just like when I write an email today, I want them to know what I meant when I said it, and not receive my email and go, I think it means he likes unicorns. Nope, that's not what I meant. Well, it doesn't matter what you meant, David. It matters what I meant. I think that's just nonsense. It does matter what I meant. And the best way we can get to what the ancient person understood or what they meant was an understanding historical and literary context. So when we do that of every single biblical text, we don't pick and choose which Bible text to put in context. We read every single narrative, every single everything in context, including Genesis. And scholars have done this for a long time. There's one scholar I mention a lot because I think he does the best job. I think he does the best job at articulating how to read Genesis in particular in an ancient context. His name is John Walton. John Walton is a very, very fine Old Testament scholar. He's a real nice, humble guy, but he also is a fine, fine scholar who I think is quite articulate and can explain his views very well. So I read Genesis in its ancient literary context, and when you do that, things make a lot more sense. There are two, you might not find that compelling. That's fine. That's fine. I'm just telling what my view is. My view is to read in its ancient context. And you can read all the scholars you want, but the one I'm recommending is John Walton, and he has a lot of books on this. For example, The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. I think his case is by far the most compelling, which means you do not read Genesis in ancient context as a science textbook. It was not a science textbook. It wasn't a textbook on biology or botany or anything else like that. It's an ancient book full of ancient narratives and ancient genres. And you need to ask the right questions of the text when you read it. If you go to the Old Testament, say, for example, Genesis 1 and 2, and ask materialistic origins, like where did the stuff come from, you're asking the wrong questions. You're asking it because you're a modern post-Enlightenment thinker. In the ancient world, they didn't think that way and they did not ask those questions much ever. What they asked was, who's in control and what's the purpose? Who's in control and what's the purpose? And when you read it like that, it is amazing how awesome it is. It's amazing how clear it is. It's amazing how it's not confusing. And it's amazing also how there's no problem whatsoever with reading it in ancient context and having no problem with modern scientific theory. My own view is that scientists, Christian and non-Christian alike, will eventually discover all kinds of more intricacies of how life, the biological mechanisms develop. As far as I understand, as far as I still believe, at the base of all development still is information. There's still DNA, RNA, and also not only just DNA, information in DNA, there's information that tells how to form the major body parts. Anyway, there's information at its core. Information must be described. It's certainly possible that scientists come to discover where this information came from, and it's not a mind. It's just that we have no experience of that whatsoever. And this is where I get frustrated for the intelligent design people because it's so profoundly unfair. What they'll say is, oh, that's just a God of the gaps theory. It's just a God of the gaps. A God of the gaps theory is a theory where we say we're ignorant, therefore God must have done it. That is not what intelligent design theorists say. They do not say we don't know God did it. What they say is we are using what's called an inference to the best explanation. And in our experience and the recorded history of all humanity, information always and only comes from a mind. It always and only comes from a mind. It doesn't mean it cannot come from somewhere else. It just means in our experience it always and only comes from a mind. Therefore, the very best thing to assume at first, the fairest thing to assume at first when we find information, which you do have an enormous amount in the cell, the human cell or any living organism cell, is we find information. So the very best and fairest thing to assume is, well, a mind must have somehow put it there. That's it. It doesn't mean God did it. It just means some mind must have been behind this because of information. Nevertheless, is it possible they find a mechanism or something that give us information? I guess it's possible. That's a hard case to make, but it's possible. Anyway, I don't doubt that scientists will continue to debate this and figure out more and more how this functions and so forth, but you still got to answer the question where the information come from in the beginning. And that problem is well known amongst biologists, and that's why as far as I know, with the specialists I've heard and read, the top theory of where information came from on this earth is from somewhere else. It's called panspermia. That is, aliens dropped it off, or it came from an asteroid, but did not develop. It came from somewhere else. It could not have just arisen by itself on this earth for a lot of reasons. But of course, that just makes the problem go back one step further, right? That is, if it came from Martians, where did the Martians get the information from? It came from somewhere. At some point, some information had to be there, and we are far away from answering that question. So I don't read Genesis as a science textbook because there is no compelling reason to read it as a science textbook. 2, it frees us up to read it well and read it correctly. And when we do read it well and read it correctly, we don't have any problem with allowing science to do what scientists do, which is try to figure out if there's any quote-unquote naturalistic explanation for why there's any development. Well, that's okay to do. And if they want to try to understand and explain where information comes from, they can try that. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean we can't be Christians at all. I just think they have a hard case to make if they think it's something inside of a non-rational process. That to me that's silly. But anyway, they can try. That's fine. So I don't read Genesis. I have no problem. I don't read Genesis as a creation textbook of how all the mechanisms work. I think there are inherent problems with that, inherent difficulties, like context and so forth, not to mention the verses themselves, which speak of the land producing things, and they don't believe that God caused all things and so forth. I'm just repeating myself. Well, then who gives a rip? Well, I do think there's an Adam and Eve. I do think with John Walton that they were not the first humans. I think the first humans that are described. I think Adam and Eve are used as archetypes, just as John Walton argues. I find his view absolutely compelling. I think Adam and Eve were the first humans who sinned. I think that sin affected other humans in that they set a real bad example, as it were. But then humans are born, and then we sin. But exactly why it is we sin is not spoken of in the text. I know what original sin people say. They're going to say we're born into it. We're born sinners. That's exactly why Augustine argued the very thing to say babies must be baptized. Because if a baby dies, that baby will go to hell or at minimum purgatory. They got to be baptized immediately because they're born as a sinner. Well, people who have argued otherwise, the long-time Protestant traditions like John Wesley and others said, no. They have to get to a place of an age of accountability. Well, that's arbitrary too, because the Bible never talks about an age of accountability, but it is trying to say that it seems false that a baby is already a sinner. I also think that's false. I think it's false. So I'm not going to talk about that right now, about that idea, but I do think Adam and Eve sinned. I do think all humans are sinners because humans sin. They do sin. Now, they just do. Whether you want to blame Adam and Eve, blame your mom and daddy, or blame your own self, the fact is you and I do, and that's culpable enough. We need Jesus. That's enough. So what do we do with creation and evolution and so forth? At minimum, no matter what the scientific explanation gets to, at minimum, here's my view. At minimum, what's at stake, the who cares, is whether or not humans are souls. No matter what, humans are souls. We are souls that have a body. We're embodied souls. Now, this is argued today, but the naysayers are wrong. We are a soul with the body. And you can go read your own arguments. Go read J.P. Moreland, What is a Soul? I've got a podcast on that. There's all kinds of literature on that. I've read the arguments against it. I don't find it compelling at all. At all. I'm convinced you and I, the person who's listening to this, You are a soul with a body. Your mind is comprehending, if I'm doing a good job, what I'm saying. Your brain isn't, but your mind is. But your mind is using your brain, sure. And your mind is telling you where to drive or what to look at or whatever it is. So all that to say, and I have a lot more about that on a soul, but the Bible makes it clear, and our experience makes it clear, that at some point God gave the hominoid soul. This cannot occur in nature. I believe that these first hominoids with a soul were Adam and Eve. That's what I think. Maybe he had soul before, maybe those souls stayed fine. But at minimum, at some point in the process, whether it took billions of years of the organism that developed over time, or if God did a special creation, whatever it is, at some point, no matter what, soul cannot be originating from a naturalistic evolutionary process, because soul is by definition, well, by most people's definition, not made of anything in nature. A soul is not made of matter and energy. Some argue that, but most do not, and I do not. I think that's also uncompelling. I think the soul is an immaterial substance. Therefore, it cannot be inside of space-time continuum, which means the space-time, nothing on this earth can make a soul. So all humans were created in Genesis 1. That's what I think. Then Adam and Eve were archetypes. They were meant to take care of the cosmic Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, which all ancient people thought the gods had gardens. That's what Eden means. And the Bible, again, never says they were the first humans, just the first ones who begin to do things in the narrative, the ones who rebel and are punished because of it. So, kind of throwing this all over the place, I just don't care much about the role of evolutionary science and creation as in a Christian worldview. If the science, how will I say it this way? If scientists demonstrate that our bodies develop over time, okay. Then as a Christian, I'm convinced God designed that ability of nature. I believe the same thing about the laws of nature. No one freaks out if I say, hey, you see that waterfall? That occurs because a force pulls the water down toward the mass of the earth. No one calls me an atheist because of that. No one says that. No one, David, God causes, he pushes the water down with his God fingers or whatever. But if you ask the question, hey, David, where did that force come from? Where did the force come from that pulls the water down toward the mass? I've got to posit something outside of nature to explain why the universe is the way it is. Well, maybe God developed a natural mechanism, like with my waterfall analogy, to develop organisms. I just don't see why there's a problem with that. The thing is, if he designed a natural mechanism to develop our body, he cannot develop a natural mechanism to create soul. Soul, by definition, is an immaterial substance. So no matter what, if the body was developing over millions and millions of years, and then finally at some point he goes, okay, I'll step in and create soul here, fine, he did. And by the way, little footnote, Christians are still divided, all the way back to Augustine, of whether or not the soul is created brand new in every human when you're born, or if it's passed down in some kind of soulish way from Adam from the very beginning. Most Christians, I think this is fair to say most, I know I am one, but I think most in my research would say that souls are created brand new. That is, I did not exist, nor did any part of, I don't have a soul that's broken off from my parents and broken off their parents all the way back to Adam. That's also another reason why original sin is so uncompelling to me. Because if God creates souls brand new, in what possible way did Adam's sin affect mine at birth? You'd have to say sin transports to DNA. I think that's dumb. Morality and my inclination to sin is not a genetic feature. There's no molecule called sin. There's no chromosome called sinner. I mean, that's just silly. I would have to be related by my soul in a moral sense to Adam, and I don't see any reason to think that. The Bible doesn't make that clear, and I think it leans toward suggesting that our souls are brand new. Now, Origen believed it was not. Our souls were out somewhere else and we're eternal and blah, blah, but that was considered heresy pretty early on. All that to say, I don't think that our souls they don't come from a natural mechanism. So I do think, no matter what, God did design a natural mechanism, and that at some point he gives this hominoid creature a soul. By the way, C.S. Lewis had the exact same view, but I do. So scientists can keep debating evolution to the nosebleeds. That's wonderful. And I don't think there is one threat whatsoever to the Christian worldview. Well, if you've listened this far and you disagree with me, you're probably very, very angry and say I'm not taking the Bible seriously, and I'm not reading Genesis well, and I don't believe in the authority of Scripture, and I don't believe in Jesus, and I can't be a Christian. And I've heard all this stuff before, and I'm sorry you think that way. I'm very, very much a devoted disciple of Jesus. I've given my life to him, and everything I do, my best is to glorify and honor him. Also, I'm doing the very best job I can to read the Bible in context, because I respect it so much. And if I can find Bible verses written in context that tell me mechanisms and how they work, and you can convince me, I will gladly publicly shout it from the rooftops and record podcasts on how I've changed my mind. I'm happy with that. But until that happens, those are some quick thoughts. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. And also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom, or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways reached out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.